In the 1950s, more than half the cars on American roads wore a GM badge. General Motors was the first corporation in history to earn $1 billion in a single year, with 600,000 employees and factories stretching across Michigan and Ohio. There was a famous saying back then that what is good for General Motors is good for the country. But by June of 2009, General Motors filed for the largest industrial bankruptcy in American history. The United States government had to inject $50 billion just to keep the company breathing. So how does the most dominant automaker on the planet destroy itself? Not with one catastrophic mistake, but with decades of them. It was 1908, and a flamboyant salesman named William Durant had just founded General Motors with Buick as its only brand. Within 18 months, Durant snapped up 30 other car companies, including Oldsmobile, Pontiac, and Cadillac. The acquisition spree was breathtaking, but it also saddled the company with debt it could not repay. By 1912, General Motors bankers had forced Durant out the door. His replacement changed everything. Alfred Sloan was a stiff, detail-obsessed engineer who understood something Henry Ford never did. Ford wanted to sell one car to everyone. Sloan wanted to sell a different car to every kind of buyer. Chevrolet for working families, Pontiac for the upwardly mobile, Oldsmobile for the quietly comfortable, Buick for the ambitious, and Cadillac for the wealthy. A car for every purse and purpose, as Sloan himself put it. It was one of the most brilliant business strategies in American history, and it worked. By the mid-1930s, GM had overtaken Ford entirely. By the 1950s, the company controlled nearly half the American automobile market, and its factories stretched across Michigan and Ohio like an industrial empire. However, dominance on that scale creates a kind of blindness, and GM was about to prove it. GM also pioneered features that defined the modern car, including automatic transmission, power steering, power brakes, and independent suspension. And perhaps most importantly, they were the first automaker to change styling every single year, training an entire generation of Americans to trade in their cars regularly. Friday nights in the 1950s meant families walking showroom floors to see the new models under fluorescent lights. GM did not just sell transportation. It sold aspiration and status, and the idea that next year's car would always be a little better than this year's. The machine was printing money, but here's the detail that explains everything that follows. At its peak in the 1950s and 60s, GM employed over 800,000 people worldwide. Entire towns in Michigan and Ohio existed because of a single GM factory. The company had its own in-house parts suppliers, its own finance arm, and enough political weight that its leaders moved between the boardroom and the White House without missing a step. And that success planted the seeds of everything that came next. Because when you dominate a market that completely, the most dangerous thing you can do is assume you always will. The first crack appeared in the 1970s, and it arrived on a cargo ship from Japan. Toyota and Honda began selling smaller, fuel-efficient cars in the American market, and General Motors executives barely noticed. When they did notice, they dismissed the imports as cheap vehicles for buyers who could not afford a real American car. That dismissal became an expensive habit. Then came the oil shocks. The crises of 1973 and 1979 sent gasoline prices surging, and suddenly millions of Americans needed something General Motors could not build: a reliable, efficient, small car. Japanese automakers had spent years perfecting exactly that. They won the subcompact market not just on price, but on something General Motors had stopped caring about: quality. A Harvard management professor named Rosabeth Moss Kanter wrote in 1984 that General Motors had become the object of suburban dinner table scorn. Everyone she met had an anecdote about why American cars were losing to the Japanese, and cost was rarely the complaint. The issue was that a Honda Civic simply worked better than a Chevette and lasted longer doing it. Meanwhile, General Motors was fighting a second war it kept losing. Labor relations. A massive strike in 1970 pulled 400,000 workers off the job for 67 days and slowed the entire American economy. To prevent future shutdowns, General Motors bought peace with increasingly lavish contracts. The pay and benefits packages became so generous that the company earned the nickname Generous Motors. By the 2000s, retiree health benefits alone added roughly $1,200 to the cost of every single car General Motors produced. Toyota did not carry that burden. Neither did Honda. Every vehicle rolling off a General Motors assembly line started the race with a financial handicap bolted to its price tag. General Motors' market share began sliding, and the company's response was to make things worse. Which brings us to Roger Smith. Smith became chief executive officer of General Motors in 1981, and he inherited a company in trouble. General Motors had just posted its first annual loss since the early 1920s. Quality complaints were piling up, and Japanese competition was no longer a minor irritant. It had become an existential threat. Smith decided that the solution was technology. If Japanese workers were more efficient than American workers, he would simply replace the workers with robots. Over the next decade, General Motors spent roughly $90 billion trying to automate its way to competitiveness. The vision was something called the Lights Out Factory, a plant so automated that the only human employee would be a security guard. The reality was a disaster. Robots on the assembly line famously painted each other instead of painting the cars. Other robotic arms welded doors shut. Automated systems broke down so frequently that production slowed to a crawl. The whole program had to be partially dismantled just a few years after installation. What comes next is the part that still does not make sense. The irony is that Smith had the answer sitting right in front of him. In 1984, General Motors formed a joint venture with Toyota called NUMMI, reopening a mothballed plant in Fremont, California. Toyota sent its managers to train General Motors workers using the Toyota production system. Using that system, the same workers General Motors had given up on were suddenly building cars at world-class quality levels, and the lesson was impossible to miss. The problem at General Motors was never its workers. It was management culture, top to bottom, and Smith chose to ignore that lesson entirely. An auto industry analyst named Mary Ann Keller later summed it up perfectly. She said Smith thought Toyota possessed some kind of magic. The joint venture proved that General Motors management was the real problem, and if that were the only mistake Smith made, this might be a different story. But he was just getting started. Instead of fixing management, Smith went shopping. He bought electronic data systems from Ross Perot for $2.5 billion. Then came Hughes Aircraft for $5 billion. Lotus was next. He poured money into everything except the one thing that mattered, building better cars. The acquisition of EDS alone triggered one of the most public corporate feuds of the decade, with Perot and Smith exchanging insults through the press, until GM paid Perot $700 million just to go away. That money could have funded an entirely new vehicle platform. Meanwhile, something quieter and arguably more damaging was happening across GM's showrooms. Badge engineering, the practice of taking one car design and slapping different brand names on it. A Chevrolet Cavalier, a Pontiac Sunfire, and an Oldsmobile Achieva would roll off the same assembly line, with the same engine, the same interior, and nearly the same body panels. The only real difference was the logo on the hood, customers noticed. If a $25,000 Buick was functionally identical to a $15,000 Chevrolet, why would anyone pay for the Buick? And somehow, it gets worse. Smith also pushed a controversial downsizing of GM's luxury models. The 1986 Cadillac Eldorado and Buick Riviera shrank dramatically, despite GM's own research showing customers found the smaller versions far less desirable. Sales of those cars dropped to less than half their previous levels almost overnight. GM's own data told them not to do it. They did it anyway. Alfred Sloan had built GM's empire on the idea that each brand meant something distinct. Badge engineering and cost-cutting destroyed that distinction in a single decade. Customers who had been loyal to Oldsmobile or Pontiac for generations looked at what those brands had become and walked away. GM's market share, which had been close to 46% when Smith took over, fell to 32% by the time he left, and it never recovered. Now, in the middle of all this decline, GM did something extraordinary, and then immediately undid it. In 1996, the company launched the EV1, an all-electric vehicle available for lease in Southern California. It was built on a lightweight aluminum frame with a three-phase AC induction motor, producing 137 horsepower. It ran on electricity, produced zero emissions, and was one of the fastest, most efficient production cars ever built. A full charge cost about $3, and you could do it overnight in your garage. It required no oil changes, no mufflers, and practically no brake maintenance. The people who leased them fell in love with them. Celebrities like Tom Hanks and Mel Gibson drove them. Waiting lists formed. About 800 people leased EV1s, and their enthusiasm bordered on obsession. The car worked. If you are finding value in this video, consider subscribing. We cover automotive history and the stories behind the industry every week. But GM saw the EV1 as a compliance project, not a product. When the California Air Resources Board weakened its zero-emission vehicle mandate under pressure from automakers, GM pulled the plug. The company recalled every single EV1, then crushed them. They flattened them in the Arizona desert. Lessees offered to buy the cars outright. GM offered $1.9 million for the remaining 78 vehicles. GM refused. Activists were arrested trying to block the car carriers, hauling the EV1s to the crusher. Rick Wagner, who was chief executive officer during the final years of the EV1, later admitted to Motor Trend magazine that killing the electric car was his worst decision. That admission carries extra weight when you know what happened next. Martin Eberhard and Mark Tarpenning watched GM destroy the EV1 and decided that since the big automakers would not build electric vehicles, someone else would have to. In July 2003, they founded Tesla Motors. 6 months later, Elon Musk became their biggest investor. GM had the technology, the manufacturing capacity, and a decade head start. They threw it away, and a startup built in a garage eventually became the most valuable car company on the planet. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. The years after the EV1 brought a different kind of failure, not a strategic blunder or a missed opportunity, but something closer to negligence. Starting around 2001, General Motors engineers discovered that the ignition switches in several of their compact cars had a flaw. A heavy keychain or a bump in the road could jostle the switch out of the on position, killing the engine while the car was moving and disabling the airbags at the moment they were needed most. General Motors knew about the defect. Internal documents confirmed it. Engineers had actually designed a better ignition switch back in 2001, one with a stronger spring that would have solved the problem. It was rejected because it cost a few extra cents per unit. The company chose the cheaper part. When complaints started rolling in, the official response to customers was to advise drivers to remove heavy items from their keychains. That was the fix. Take your keys off the lanyard. For over a decade, people kept driving those cars and people kept dying in them. It was not a government agency that eventually forced the recall. It was a single attorney in Marietta, Georgia named Lance Cooper. He was representing the family of a young woman killed in a crash and obtained thousands of pages of internal General Motors documents through discovery. Those documents proved that General Motors had known about the defect for years and deliberately chosen not to fix it because the repair would have cost a few dollars per vehicle. When General Motors finally issued the recall in February 2014, it initially acknowledged 13 deaths. By the time the compensation fund finished its work, that number had climbed to 124. Nearly 30 million vehicles were recalled worldwide. An internal investigation described an 11-year pattern of incompetence and neglect. If you are wondering how a company survives something like that, here is the answer. It barely did. By the time the ignition switch scandal became public, General Motors had already been through its darkest chapter. The 2008 financial crisis did not create General Motors' problems, but it stripped away every cushion the company had been leaning on. For years, General Motors had survived on SUV profits. Vehicles like the Chevrolet Tahoe and GMC Yukon carried enormous profit margins that subsidized the losses on smaller cars General Motors could never quite get right. When gasoline prices spiked above $4 a gallon, SUV sales collapsed practically overnight. The vehicles sitting on dealer lots went from cash machines to expensive dead weight. Credit markets froze. Consumers stopped buying cars entirely. And General Motors, buried under decades of accumulated obligations, pension commitments, healthcare costs for 377,000 retirees, and a dealer network bloated far beyond what the market could support, simply ran out of road. The company predicted it would be out of cash entirely by mid-2009 without government intervention. On June 1, 2009, General Motors filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The government bailout totaled roughly $50 billion. Taxpayers eventually recovered most of it, but estimates suggest they lost about $11 billion on the deal. The restructuring killed entire brands. Pontiac, the car for the upwardly mobile, was discontinued. Saturn, Roger Smith's grand experiment, was shut down. Oldsmobile had already been killed off in 2004, and Hummer, the vehicle that perhaps best symbolized GM's inability to read the room, followed them all into extinction. The company that emerged from bankruptcy was smaller, leaner, and arguably more focused. But consider what it took to get there. The largest industrial bankruptcy in history, tens of billions in government support, the destruction of shareholder value accumulated over a century, and the erasure of brands that had been part of American culture since before most of us were born. The question people always ask about GM is, who was responsible? Which CEO made the fatal call? But that framing misses the point. The collapse of GM was not a single decision, but a culture. A pattern repeated across decades of protecting short-term comfort instead of building for the future. Every executive team inherited problems from the last one and passed them along to the next. When everyone is responsible, no one is. And when no one is responsible, the problems compound until the weight of them becomes impossible to carry. Alfred Sloan built General Motors by understanding what customers wanted before they knew it themselves. Somewhere along the way, the company decided it could tell customers what to want instead. The distance between those two ideas is the distance between 50% market share and a bankruptcy courthouse. GM is still here. It is profitable. It is investing billions in electric vehicles, decades after crushing the ones it already had. The Chevrolet Bolt came and went. The company has staked its future on a new electric platform and a battery technology called Ultium. Whether this chapter turns out to be a genuine comeback story or just a slower version of the same pattern depends on whether the company finally learned the lesson it has been ignoring since the 1970s. That the market does not care how big you used to be. It only cares about what you are building right now. If this story stayed with you, the video on screen right now covers another automaker, one that had the world in its hands and let it slip away.